Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be kind of doing an open mic, hopefully. And then also I kind of wanted to talk about for a little bit like what we plan on doing in the future. So what is the future of this channel? I think part of it is we want to start pumping out videos more regularly. I don't know. I can't talk today. So the goal of this channel right now is just to kind of like, we post once in a while and we just do it when we get a time. But hopefully, since school's wrapping up and everything, we're hoping to kind of have, weekly videos and kind of schedule things out so that we can have more content out there and reach more people and have a bigger subscriber base. So that's part of what we hope to do. Another thing we hope to do is be able to debate. So, we hope to be able to have a few people on here, and we'll kind of hope to do more discussions. Hope to do more where we have someone come on and, maybe one of us will take them on and we'll kind of do a debate type thing. And then another thing we hope to do is kind of host debates. So, have a person on, hopefully we can get in contact with a few people. I think we're in contact with a few people now and seeing what we can do in terms of setting up debates, because I don't know, debates seem to be the big topic right now. If you want your channel to grow, you host debates or you do something of that sort. So that's another thing we hope to do, is kind of start getting in contact with people and hosting debates. And so if you know anybody who would want to come on or know anybody that would like to do that, then reach out to us, get in touch. I think our email is in our like bio, but I'm not 100% sure. Hopefully I'll be able to update that and kind of get that ball rolling. And then, and we hope to kind of mix that with our also original content. So we kind of hope to do debates here and there, and then, maybe do debate reviews. We hope to host a few after shows, and then mix it in with our regular videos where we kind of review videos and stuff like that. But at the same time, when we go into this future of the channel, we hope to get a bigger subscriber base. And that's one of our main goals, is to be able to kind of reach more people and talk with more people and get our channel out there. So that's kind of what we're looking at. I hope everybody enjoys the content we put out now, but it's been a little bit hard to get everything to get everything out and to do a lot of that stuff because of just schedules and school and stuff like that. It gets very challenging to work around schedules. So I hope everyone enjoys what we've put out. I know I had my recent interview with Daniel Ray. That went very well. I want to thank him for that. I hope to do more of those stuff. And I know I actually want to start like doing recorded videos. Like I think I released one earlier. I think it was like 3 minutes or something like that. And I really enjoyed putting that together, although the program I was using was kind of glitching and messing up. And so I had some typos. So that we hope to kind of change, be able to pump out more of those videos. Another thing we hope to do is kind of have more open discussions. So have more where everyone can come in. If you want to come in, you can come in, because that also helps. But I think a lot of the challenges is just, we're trying to compete with big channels, and, it's hard for 3 teenagers to go up against, people who can spend their day doing this. So yeah, we're really trying to work towards building up everything and making more content, making more better quality videos and better quality reviews and better aesthetics and better graphics. Just currently, we are a little bit short on resources, a little bit short on time, but like I said, hopefully that'll change. So now I think I'm going to kind of open it up for um, an open room and see if anybody wants to join. I think Gabe and Chris should be coming here soon, and then we can kind of get stuff started, I guess. Um, uh, let's see. If you do debates, I hope you're still yeah, well, we hope to get out more original content and kind of pump that out along with a lot of the debates and interviews and discussions and stuff like that. So yeah, we're planning on doing that. And hope that our channel should come along. It's early. It's only been up for about 4 months. So yeah, we'll keep up with the original content. Oh, I don't know why you're the only person commenting. Come on, people. Like, channel's not that bad. But yeah, I just I kind of wanted to update everybody on what we're planning to do and how we're planning to do it and kind of what the future holds, which I I hope it'll be better. Right now, like I said, just super hard to keep up with everything and do school and do the channel and do just our regular work and just daily stuff, because I don't nobody wants to spend their whole entire day doing school and then coming home and working on a video. So I hope we can kind of pump that out. So I'm gonna go ahead and open it up for open discussion, and then whoever pops in, um, that'll be great, and we'll kind of start off from there. Also, I wanted to know, does anybody have any suggestions for videos to review? Because I know that's kind of been what we've been doing these past times, and we have a lot of videos we kind of want to do, but a lot of the videos we look at are just super long. There's streams like this where they'll go on for an hour, and those are really hard to respond to. So does anyone have any videos they would like me to check out, and we'll see what we could review. Um, I think right now, while we're waiting for people to come in, I'm going to go ahead and actually go through one video that I thought was interesting. But yeah, if you have any videos, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, so we're going to go through a video by Paul Williams. also known as Blogging Theology, a big Muslim YouTuber, big subscriber base. And so he posted a video about 2 months ago on Matthew and who saw him and a lot of that stuff that I think would be interesting to go through, because he builds off of a book. He basically goes through a book by a scholar, and they talk about how these experiences in Matthew and everything point to, he kind of draws weird conclusions. So I think we're going to go through that, and then we'll wait to see if somebody like Gabe will join here in a few.
Story of the death and resurrection of Jesus and his appearance to the disciples is arguably the central message of the New Testament. One of the accounts of this is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, where it says in the Bible, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age.'" Now, I want to share with you some scholarly commentary on this passage by the author of this book, Jesus of Nazareth, an independent historian's account of his life and teaching, by Maurice Casey, who's an interesting guy. He happens to be not only a professor of New Testament languages and literature at the University of Nottingham in the UK, but he's one of a handful of scholars worldwide who are fluent in Aramaic, the language that Jesus himself spoke. And a lot of this book is taken up with his translation of some of these Greek sayings in the New Testament back into Aramaic. And he really discloses the fact that a lot of these statements are quite different in Aramaic. They have a different meaning. But I'm not going to go into that in this video. I want to share with you his comments on the passage I've just read in Matthew 28. Now, this book is written by a scholar for students of the New Testament. It's not meant really for a lay audience. So I'll try and unpack some of what he says as I go along, but please bear that in mind. So he writes on page 279, Matthew concludes the passage we've just read with one major resurrection appearance to the 11 in Galilee. Apart from an appearance to ensure that the women told the disciples where to go earlier in Matthew 28, an untrue story because it contradicts the Gospel of Mark, our oldest narrative.
Well, so kind of right there, he kind of throws in the jab of it contradicts the Gospel of Mark, which I don't think is true. So basically, Paul Williams' claim here is to sum it all up without him actually saying it, is that since this scholar knows Aramaic and says the Gospels are contradicting, kind of he draws that and says, okay, then they must be contradicting, and he must know what he's talking about, which I can't correct him on the Aramaic because obviously I don't speak it. But a lot of this stuff is, he's a skeptical scholar. So obviously he's going to just throw out certain things and be like, they're contradicting, therefore they are unreliable, which is surprising to me because historians use a lot of contradictory accounts, and then draw conclusions from those accounts. Because what's interesting here is that they'll throw out a quasi-contradictory account with Mark and Matthew, and they'll say it's unreliable because it's contradictory. But then when they go into other studies of that time, they'll use contradictory accounts to get a point across, or to, well, that's fine, they're contradicting, we just have to draw the conclusion from them, right? So what's interesting there is why he throws it out immediately, because it's supposedly contradicting, which is interesting to me, being that he himself and many scholars use contradictory accounts all the time. So yeah, that always surprised me when he talks about that.
Narrative source, Matthew 28, is the earliest written narrative of a resurrection appearance. Moreover, unlike most of the narratives of resurrection appearances, this one may be thought to agree up to a point with one of the appearances recorded in a very old tradition passed on by the Apostle Paul.
So he's talking about, when he mentions it, this is one of the first. So Matthew is, after Mark, is the only gospel to actually mention in the original writings an appearance. So in Mark, it ends abruptly with the women at the tomb. So basically, he writes down the women at the tomb, then they run away, and then it just ends. A lot of our earliest manuscripts and our earliest accounts don't include that. And I know Ian Mills and some other scholars talked about like different endings to Mark, but I know like Gabe holds more of the position that it was kind of a creed. The end of Mark was kind of more of a creed at that time. I know scholars hold certain positions on that, but when he talks about how Matthew, this appearance is the only appearance, until you get to Luke and stuff like that, he's correct in that. But obviously, the ascension, I don't believe, I could be wrong, I don't believe the ascension is the only appearance Matthew talks about, but I could be wrong. I could be thinking of another book.
This begins its record of appearances. Now he quotes 1 Corinthians 15. This was a letter by Paul written in the early AD 50s. Matthew is usually thought to have been written AD 85, 1995. So
that is one really late date. He really dated Matthew late. Most even skeptical scholars will give you like 70. Some will give you before, but most will give you like 70, possibly 75. Matthew, I can't think of a scholar that dates Matthew to 95. That'd be dating it right along with John. And I don't even know if John was in 95. I think we have better reasons to believe it was earlier. So that's a really late date.
Quite a bit later. So he's about to read an account in 1 Corinthians, which is our earliest account in the New Testament, or earliest mention of the resurrection appearances. This begins its record of appearances. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, 1 Corinthians 15:5. He appeared to Cephas, which is another word for Peter, and then to the 12 disciples. The question as to how much truth is to be found in this story is accordingly important. This story refers to the story in Matthew. Tom Wright comments, the strongest mark of authenticity in this paragraph is the jarring note, but some doubted, in verse 17. You may not have even noticed when I read that passage out in Matthew's gospel, it actually says that some of the disciples doubted even after seeing the resurrected Jesus. This strange comment, says Tom Wright, would not have occurred to someone telling the story as a pure fiction, end quote. So Tom Wright.
So, yeah, here he quotes N.T. Wright. I think he's quoting his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. I believe that's the book he's quoting. And he basically talks about how the doubting part of the Gospels is more of a sign of authenticity than of pure myth or pure literary device or something like that. When it might have been a literary device, but more a mark of authenticity, of they actually were writing what supposedly these people experienced. The person in the video that I'm responding to right now is Paul Williams of Blogging Theology. Yeah, that's who's in the video right now that I'm responding to.
Wright, who's been quoted here, is saying that the very fact that Matthew included this statement that some of the disciples doubted is an indicator of authenticity of the passage. Morris Casey then continues, this is true as far as it goes. It means that some of the 11 disciples were not convinced by an experience which others interpreted as an experience of Jesus. It's very interesting, isn't it? So
that's not necessarily true. Now I know I don't fully want to go totally against Morris Casey here. Obviously, I'm not a scholar, but that's not necessarily when it talks about doubting means. When you look at the doubting in the other gospels, because about doubting in terms of they didn't believe, they didn't necessarily had a concept of like, they were like, is this, OMG, is this actually Jesus? Like, is this actually who we're seeing? If I saw, my dead grandpa, okay, I'm going to doubt for a little bit too. But at the same time, I don't think it's fully referring to a doubting of just they didn't believe it ever, and they doubted the whole entire time. I think he's kind of making a leap in logic there. Yeah.
He's saying some thought it was a resurrection appearance, some didn't. So not all of the disciples were convinced that Jesus rose from the dead, it would seem. This is another piece of evidence that we must view the early list of appearances in 1 Corinthians 15 with a degree of skepticism, because in Paul's account there's no mention of the disciples doubting what they had seen.
That's another point, though, is when Paul mentions it in 1 Corinthians, it's a creed. It's not meant to be a detailed account. It is a short oral creed. So they're not going to add in a bunch of stuff like, he appeared to Cephas and Cephas doubted or something of that sort. It's a creed. It's meant to be concise. So that doesn't make any sense in what he's trying to apply to. He's saying, well, because Paul never mentions they doubted means somehow we have some sort of unreliable account here, which is another leap in logic because it's a creed, right? These, especially Jewish creeds at the time, they were all oral. Well, most were oral. And so they were meant to be short and easy to remember. Even though, the oral culture of that time was very, very experienced in that, but still they're meant to be short.
The sole appearance of which we have a narrative account was not as straightforward as we might have believed from reading Paul's list. Paul's list is straightforward. He appeared to so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. But in Matthew's later version, it said that some of them doubted, and that's missing from Paul's account.
Now, again, to address that, obviously it's a creed. They're not going to add that in there. They're going to say, and here's the thing, he appeared to the 12. If you read it, he appeared. Does that mean that none of them doubted? No, it just means he appeared to the 12. Or he appeared to, 10 out of the 12. They are interpreted as an appearance, and then the other 2 doubted, right? It never goes into detail. And so it doesn't have to because it's a creed. So he's kind of trying to put a stipulation on what Paul should have said. Second, here's the other thing I want to add. Paul is earlier. We always trust the earlier sources first, right? So if Paul is not mentioning in this creed, if we take their stipulation, if Paul's not mentioning doubt, then it's more likely they didn't than what Matthew writes. Now, I don't take that position. I think it's a creed, so it's not meant to be detailed. But if we're saying it's meant to be, they should have added that extra detail in there, then fine, we should trust Paul and say they didn't doubt then. So they're sort of kind of messing with themselves on a certain level.
Secondly, this raises the question as to how many of the 11 disciples obeyed the ringing commands of Matthew 28:19. The most important is, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. You might remember Jesus said, "Go therefore into all the nations and making disciples and baptizing in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." Did the 11 disciples do this? He says, no.
So I want to go through this too. He just flat out says no, which is also a lie. Like, he just goes, "Oh, well, no, they didn't." And that is another big thing. That's a lie too. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna try and pull up the graph by Sean McDowell, and he actually has a graph of the apostles that died, which means probably they were preaching something. You could theoretically say that was something else, but I highly doubt it. But yeah, that was another big leap in logic. There is that, like, none of them preached. Obviously, Paul did, Peter did, James did, and we can make a case for some of the other ones. Now, do we know all 12 did? Not for sure, but I don't think we have to, given that, the ones we know that the accounts are centered around all did. So I wouldn't say it's unreasonable to conclude the others didn't either. And also, Paul talks about in some of his letters how he couldn't talk to some of the disciples because they were other countries or other lands at the time, possibly preaching. So it's a hard thing, because he's kind of like throwing out he's throwing out good scholarship just to make a point, which I don't think should be done.
Only Peter is even known to have traveled in the diaspora, that's outside of Israel, into the Jewish communities around the Greco-Roman world. And when Paul met the inner group of three, James, Cephas, and John,
I don't think that's fully true. I think Paul traveled outside. I think in one of his accounts he talks about traveling outside. So I don't think that's fully true. Another thing is I think he goes into later, but let me bring up this graph here for a second. Let's stop. So this is actually, it's very, very small. But we know Peter died and Paul died. We know James, the brother of Jesus, died. Then we know James, son of Zebedee. Then we know Thomas and Andrew. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 5. And then you get to the other apostles down here. And these are, now, keep in mind, this is deaths by martyrdom. So this is not preaching per se, but this is death by being killed for what they were talking about. So we at least have 5 here, and then you have the other ones down here that weren't martyred, but probably were preaching something. They may not have been martyred because they may have stayed inside the realm of the Jewish culture, but we know at least on that we have 5 that were martyred. So he's already kind of screwed it up there, because he's only said Peter, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they were preaching outside the realm or outside of the Jewish culture, because obviously Paul wrote letters outside. Peter traveled outside, and James was the head of the church at the time. So he kind of screwed himself up there. I don't agree with all that. But yeah, so there's one part, and then he'll kind of, we're only like halfway through the video, so we better kind of get on with it.
In Jerusalem, they agreed that we to the nations, but they to the circumcision. That means that even the inner group of three did not go and make disciples of all the nations. They stayed in Jerusalem. Moreover, the rest of
not true. I know in other letters, Paul talks about how he couldn't get a hold of some of the disciples because they were out doing work. So that's not true either. He lied there too. I don't know if he's saying that directly from Casey or if he's getting that from like his own mind, but yeah, that's not true either. It preached around the Jewish area, and Peter preached outside. Paul wrote letters outside, and obviously somebody was preaching outside because Paul was writing to churches outside of the Jewish area, right? Paul himself went to Greece. Like, he's only saying, oh, we only know Peter, but that's not true. So, I mean, I'm very confused as to what scholars he's leaning on here. Is he leaning on like Richard Carrier, or who's he talking to here?
to the 11 are unheard of thereafter. Interesting. Accordingly, whatever happened when Jesus appeared to the 11 in Galilee, it was not a clear speech to all of them at once, in which Jesus commanded them to carry out the Gentile mission. Matthew has written this into Jesus' speech because it was of central importance to the churches when he wrote.
So I'd be very interested to hear the reasoning behind that, because on one hand, earlier in the video, it talks about how it was a sign of authenticity. And then in this part of the video, he's like, never mind, it's not authentic. He added stuff in. So I would be interested to hear their reasoning for that. But let's get
now. Some Christians may complain, or some people hearing this may think, "Hang on, don't we have letters by Peter, for example, 1 and 2 Peter?" Well, not really. 2 Peter, for example, is probably the clearest example in the whole of the New Testament of what's called a pseudepigrapha, which is a.
So he's going to go into what pseudo Pithrica is. So basically, he's going to explain how pseudo means like forged or fake, and Pithrica means writing, right? So he's going to say 2 Peter is a forged writing. That's still highly debated even amongst Christian scholars, right? So, and I wouldn't agree with him there. I think Hebrews would be closer. Hebrews is very debated as to who wrote it, and was it a forgery or not. Obviously, at the Council of Nicaea, they had strict stipulations as to what they added and didn't, and they believed Hebrews made the cut. So obviously there was some importance to it, or maybe it. I think some scholars take it as they liked Hebrews theology, believed it taught what the Gospels taught, and so they added it in. So Hebrews is probably the most disputed, but 2 Peter is right after Hebrews. I'm more to the view that 2 Peter is an actual work of Peter. Now, that's still highly debated. I don't really want to get deep into that because it's very hard to it's easy to misunderstand. But I believe that 2 Peter, because it's very close to 1 Peter, a lot of the theology in it is pretty close. A lot of the depictions and words used and stuff like that is very close to 1 Peter, which I believe is a writing of Peter actually too. So I think here I disagree that 2 Peter is a blatant forgery.
A scholarly way of saying a forgery. Pseudo means false, as in you fake. Epigrapha comes from the word writing, means fake writing. virtually all New Testament scholars in the world, and you can look this up for yourself, have concluded that 2 Peter is not by Peter.
They haven't concluded on anything, like close to anything, on 2 Peter. It's highly debated. Even if 2 scholars agree on they think it's fake, they're going to disagree on the methods by which it's fake and who faked it and when was it fake. Like, it's still highly, highly debated. It's not a consensus. There is no consensus there, really. So that's also another thing I would point out, although it's not such a big deal that he stated here.
It's a forgery written sometime in the 2nd century. We don't actually have anything by any of Jesus' original disciples. Paul, of course, we do have.
And then he made a claim that we'd have nothing of Jesus' original disciples. So this, again, is another disputed claim. Now, obviously, it's a little bit less disputed than something like 2 Peter, but it's still disputed. Many people don't, you have skeptics who don't think Paul was the only source, and then, Matthew and Mark. But I think it's reasonable to conclude that Mark was written by Mark, at least Mark is attributed to. Now, you get into what they call the synoptic problem. You get into where, Matthew and Mark are super, super close in their writings. Now, I think part of that is it's presenting more of a false dichotomy, but that's for another video. So I think here I would disagree that we have no writings of apostles, or not apostles, disciples, because I think John can be made to be a disciple, even though it's later. Your very, very conservative scholars go with a late 70s, early 80s, sometimes mid 80s, and your extremely skeptical scholars will place it in early 90s all the way up to some place it in mid 2nd century. So I think John was authentic. So even if we only take John, you have one writing of a disciple of Jesus. So I think I disagree with him there too.
Letters by him, but he's not a person who ever met Jesus in the flesh. So continuing, what then of the baptism of baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit in Matthew 28:19? Is this what we find the 11 doing in the book of Acts? The book of Acts, of course, is the earliest history of the early church we have. No, says Morris Casey. Distinctive Christian baptism is first mentioned in Acts 2:38, where Peter urges people to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, and people were baptized accordingly. It turns out that none of them, in the whole of Acts, no one is baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Peter is the only one of the 11 to stay in the story for any length of time as the gospel is spread to the Gentiles, and after a while he disappears too. So
I actually want to go back and see what he says there, because I think it's interesting what he says there.
Command allegedly made them. In the whole of Acts, no one is baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Peter is the only one of the 11 to stay in the story for any length of time as the gospel is spread to the Gentiles, and after a while he disappears too.
So obviously I think what they're wanting is nitty-gritty details. Okay, so what they're wanting is detailed accounts of baptismal services. Basically is the basics of what they're wanting here, and I don't think that's reasonable. Right? So you're writing a gospel. You're not going to go into detail about things you feel is unimportant. When you baptize someone, even if you don't say, I baptize you in the, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, obviously, if you're being baptized by a disciple or a preacher, that's probably their intention behind it. I don't think it's really super important to be able to outline that. He also talks about how he doesn't see baptism in a lot of Acts. I think you do, but I don't think, again, it's another detail thing. They don't find baptism super, super important. They find detailing the leaders of the church and the gospel spreading and stuff like that. So they didn't detail a lot of that stuff in Acts either. Like I think the gospel writers did a good job of kind of filtering out what they felt was important and what they felt was a little bit more secondary. Like they'll mention it, but they won't like go into detail. So obviously go into detail about like appearances and stuff like that, except for possibly Mark. But in Jesus' teachings, but they don't go in, they don't go into detailed accounts of, certain baptisms of people during Jesus's ministry, right? Even though obviously Jesus was there to baptize them, they don't go into detail about that. The only baptism they go into detail about is Jesus's baptism, and obviously that's expected given that it's Jesus. So I think that's expected.
So this command allegedly made by Jesus in Matthew 28 is not evidenced in the activity of the disciples at all. They didn't do it, which is peculiar, to put it mildly. We must conclude that the second major instruction in Matthew's account of this appearance was not clearly delivered by the risen Jesus.
So it doesn't mean it wasn't clearly delivered. Now, I think, possibly, all right, I'll grant you the case. For argument's sake, they didn't, okay? That doesn't mean God or Jesus didn't clearly make it out. It means that they didn't listen to it. That doesn't mean he didn't clearly make it, at least from the writing, right? So I think he's kind of going into random things here that he feels helps him, even though I don't think it really does.
Would say that's putting it mildly. By now, the nature of Matthew's account is beginning to become a little clearer. At first sight, it appears to be the same appearance as was known to Paul's earlier tradition in 1 Corinthians. On close examination, however, the most important quality of these traditions is that they have both been rewritten. We have seen this with the Pauline tradition already. He discusses this earlier in the chapter. Nonetheless, the fact that its list of appearances begins with an appearance to Cephas is plausible. Next, it says that Jesus appeared to the 12. It does not say at once, as it does in the next appearance of over 500 brethren at once, which is in 1 Corinthians 15.
Right. So again, he's obviously this is a creed, right? So Paul's not being from deeply Jewish roots. He's not going to mess with the creed. So he's not going to add detail to it. He's going to keep the creed how he heard it or how it was written earlier, right? So we're not going to get a lot of detail in these creeds. So obviously, I think that's another issue with this, is that he's expecting detail, and obviously, Paul talks about how he basically says appeared to 500 brethren at once, right? Many scholars think that, well, not many, but many scholars think that the appearance to the 500 is a reference to the ascension. So you'll see it depicted in certain art and things where you have large crowds of people watching Jesus ascend. So certain scholars will actually think that the 500, the reference to the 500 by Paul, is a reference to the ascension in Matthew and some of the other Gospels. So you also have to look at that variable too. Is it's possible Paul is actually referring to the ascension with the 500. Also, he talks about how they've been changed. I don't think they've been changed. I think the manuscripts we have and the evidence we have shows that the Matthew we have now is very similar to what was actually written. And I think the tradition there hasn't really changed. Especially given if we go back in Matthew, given Jesus' teachings, it's very plausible he actually said what is said in Matthew at the ascension. So I don't think we can really rule that out at all either. I think he's kind of jumping to conclusions there. Obviously, he means well, but I think he's just kind of throwing stuff out to throw stuff out because, it makes his case better. I don't know.
15. Matthew, however, has clearly interpreted this, or a similar tradition, has interpreted this as a single simultaneous appearance to the 11 disciples, those left of the 12. Obviously, Judas Iscariot had left at that point. Moreover, unlike the earlier Pauline tradition, Matthew has placed this supposedly single appearance in Galilee. The most important point is, however, the comment that when Jesus appeared, some doubted.
The best form of charity is giving water to drink. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
That's Matthew 28:17 again.
So
this is a point which we would never have guessed.
So I actually think here he's not helping himself. Like N.T. Wright said, talking about how the disciples doubted is a sign of authenticity, of actually knowing what was going on there and not just making it up. Second, he can't really he's just kind of throwing stuff out. I don't think, let's see, I don't remember exactly this one.
Unlike the earlier Pauline tradition, Matthew has placed this supposedly single appearance in Galilee. The most important point is, however, the comment that when Jesus appeared, some doubted. That's Matthew.
So there, right? That's what he says. Some doubted. So I don't think that helps him. I actually think it may sound weird. I actually think this hinders his case. And you might ask, well, why does it hinder his case? Why does how does this not help his case? I think that's because, first, like N.T. Wright said, and I already mentioned, it shows signs of authenticity. Second, it shows that obviously the disciples didn't just pick up and believe it randomly. They obviously had some sort of reluctance to their supposed belief in this risen Messiah. And it also shows that Jesus's experiences weren't just picked up and rolled with. Obviously, there were skeptics. And there were people around who, if it was some hallucination, would have been like, whoa, hold on, it's a hallucination type thing. And also shows how if some doubted, then something like a mass religious hallucination is a little bit less probable because they doubted and they didn't fully pick up on it for a while. So I think this actually hinders his case instead of helps his case.
Matthew 28:17 again. This is a point which we would never have guessed if we had only to rely on the early tradition transmitted by Paul. And it must be true for two reasons, he says. One is that most of the 11 disciples do not turn up in the early church at all. So what happened to Barnabas? What happened to Andrew? What happened? If you think of the list of the Thaddeus.
So I know Barnabas is actually mentioned with Paul. James is mentioned, and then I showed that graph, and other things. So obviously, there was mention of them at least in the other Gospels. Now, how much evidence you put on that, I don't know, but there's at least mention to some of the other disciples in the Gospels. So we have that too. I think he's kind of I think what he's doing there is he's overstating what I think he thinks that this case makes the resurrection implausible when in fact he's actually helping the resurrection case. What he's saying is they just pick up and it's authentic, and he's kind of showing here. I mean, he may be pointing out, well, there's conflict in Paul's account, but I don't think there is, because Paul's account is a creed, except for his personal account. But Paul's retelling of the appearances to the disciples is a creed. We don't need a lot of detail in a creed.
What happened to these people? We don't know. That is why Matthew could not leave this point out. The second reason follows ineluctably. This is not something which the early church would make up out of nothing. It must reflect the lack of faith in the resurrection by at least some of the 11 disciples.
Correct. So I already pointed that out. It shows that these apostles, or not apostles, but disciples, didn't just pick this up and roll with it. They had doubts, and they had reluctancy, and they had issues with this belief, right? So it's not helping his case. He's saying it's authentic because of these reasons, but it also, but see, they doubted, but it doesn't show what he thinks it shows. It shows that the disciples didn't just pick it up, which could help.
What is even more devastating is that this is the point at which the whole tradition of appearances of the religion of the risen Jesus begins to fall apart. Why do we not have accurate narrative accounts of genuine appearances of the risen Jesus? Why are we not told what happened when Jesus appeared to Cephas, over 500 brethren, and then James and all the apostles, as narrated in 1 Corinthians 15?
So, like I stated, okay, so it's possible, and I know some scholars might take the stance, that when Matthew and the other Gospels are talking about the ascension and the speech Jesus gave, they are referring to the 500 Paul talks about, except for the reason that Paul is quoting a creed. So Paul is quoting a creed, not necessarily giving a detailed account of what happened at the ascension. So I don't think it works there either. And again, I already went into why I don't think this conflicts with Paul at all, because Paul never means to give a detailed account.
Matthew has supplied us with 2 points which enable us to understand this. First, again, some doubted, Matthew 28:17. Too much concentration on that would not make for the successful preaching of good news. Matthew can have transmitted it only if it was desperately unforgettable. Secondly, the 11 did not obey 2 major commands which Matthew has the risen Jesus give them in his rather short speech. The only way of understanding this is that Matthew has rewritten the tradition of this appearance which he received, or has invented Jesus' speech, because the tradition did not tell him that Jesus made a speech, and perhaps did not tell him that he appeared to the 11 all at once. We must take these 2 points together. First, some of the 11 did not believe in Jesus' resurrection and did not play any significant role in the early church as Jesus. So
again, he basically runs over the same points this whole entire video. But I don't think this means what he thinks it means.
I thought Mom never uses the whole film.
Basically, it means that when Matthew talks about the appearances, that it's authentic. So basically, he states it's authentic, but it's not authentic while being authentic. Like, I don't think that works, right? Like, and then he talks about how it's conflicting with Paul's view, but I don't think it is, because Paul is stating a creed.
Jesus was supposed to have commanded. This is what made some doubted unforgettable. Secondly, we do not have accurate accounts of genuine appearances of the risen Jesus, because these were not helpful enough for the needs of the early churches. That is a strong argument against the genuineness of the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. And I'll end that there.
So, yeah, basically, this whole entire thing is kind of dumb, to be honest, because it doesn't show anything. It shows that Matthew is stating some of them doubted. Okay, some doubted. All right, well, that's fine. does that mean when Jesus gives the command, does that mean all the disciples are going to listen? I wouldn't think so. Obviously, according to his teachings, we're sinful and we have these type of things. So I don't think that's expected either. It's kind of a big old bag of, hey, look, I can come up with a reason to assert my beliefs that I doubt it, and then just walk away being like, see, I disproved the genuineness of the gospel accounts. He first off never addresses John or Mark or Luke or some of the stuff in Acts. He just goes straight from Matthew, which I find weird, saying that this somehow disproves the genuineness of the gospel accounts.
I think Professor Morris Casey raises some very important points here. That most of the disciples who are listed in our earliest sources, we know nothing about what happened to them after Jesus was raised to heaven. They simply disappear from the pages of history. We know from Matthew that some, maybe many, half of them, we don't know what some means. It could be half the disciples simply didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, even after they were present.
Or it could simply be that they were preaching and they, in Jerusalem, and nobody thought it was really a big enough thing to write about. So obviously, this is basically getting down to assumptions. It's basically, well, this is my belief versus your belief. We don't really have evidence for quote unquote either, but I'm just going to go with mine. So yeah, I think we have to be careful there, because he's just kind of like stating things and it doesn't really make a ton of sense. And it doesn't really prove what he thinks it does.
Present at what other disciples thought was appearances of the risen Jesus.
Focus on Yemen, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Daily life.
So the disciples weren't agreed then. They weren't unanimous at all that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to people. This is a belief of some of them, it seems, but primarily it's a belief of the Apostle Paul, who I personally have no doubt had a vision. He even calls it a vision in Acts.
So I don't. Second, the vision he's quoting is not just a vision. In fact, the word Paul uses doesn't mean a vision. It actually means some type of physical interaction, or he physically saw Jesus. He didn't interpret it as just a vision. So that's also another thing to keep into account.
On the road to Damascus, of a light which he understood to be the risen Jesus himself. And Paul is the main dynamo, the main power behind the gospel to the Gentiles that converted so many people. But he never knew Jesus. He never met him. Jesus ascended to heaven at least several years before Paul even became a Christian. So I think that this is very interesting. I know this is quite heavy, but to give you a flavor of how scholars interact with the text and the piercing intellectual insight I think that they bring to the subject. Until next time.
So that was an interesting video. And, as I said, I don't think it means what he thinks it means. But, I think a lot of what is said there is not true, or it is true, but it is not to be placed in the meaning he thinks it does, in the meaning Morris Casey thinks it does. Because, Paul is not, he's quoting a creed. There's no need for detail there. Second, it could be that the ascension is actually where he appeared to 500, which would make sense. I mean, if he's giving a big speech, such as go make disciples of the earth, it would make sense that there would be a big crowd. It would make sense that in this ascension, it would draw a big crowd. Like, I think it's plausible that the ascension is actually the appearance to the 500. So that's another thing to think about there too. But I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you for everyone for watching, and I hope everyone has a good week. We should be back next weekend and hopefully next week after school ends. So yeah.